So I think to your question, when we think about urban development in the era of climate breakdown, we really have to think about issues as systems that are really, really interlinked. They're not linear problems that can be solved with sort of singular solution. And what we really need is a whole kind of suite of fixes to tackle issues from multiple avenues, which means also kind of diversifying the people and the voices that are coming into the room as we're discussing urban issues and as we're discussing climate issues especially.
Welcome to another episode of the Climate Conscious Podcast. I am your host, Derval Barzey. And today I'm joined by Dorraine Duncan. Hi, Dorraine.
Hey, Derval, how are you?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm doing well on this rainy Tuesday in Jamaica, Kingston.
So glad to have you on the podcast.
Thank you. I've been a fan for a while, so I'm happy to be joining you.
Dorraine Duncan is a city planner and policy analyst with expertise in energy and environmental policy in the US, Latin America, and the Caribbean. She is the founder of Island City Lab, a Jamaican-based urban planning think tank that aims to mobilize civic thinkers to confront the defining issues facing the urban development of Caribbean towns and cities. We're here today to talk about the intersection of urban development and climate change. We'll be looking at how Caribbean cities can adapt, innovate, and transform for a more sustainable and resilient future. Now, urban development refers to the way that we plan, design, construct, and manage our towns and cities. But it's not just about physical infrastructure like roads, bridges, public transportation systems, and utilities, but it also encompasses economic and social elements. It involves things like housing, environmental sustainability, social services, community engagement, and disaster preparedness. All these things come together to contribute to efficient, sustainable, and thriving urban environments. So, Dorraine, in your experience as a city planner, what are the most pressing challenges when it comes to urban development in the Caribbean?
Yeah, thank you for that question, Derval. So I think in the context of climate breakdown, which is this new era that we're in, I think that I think we all know that the Caribbean is really on the front line of very complex and catastrophic changes to not just our weather, but to our environment and consequently our societies and our communities, right? And I think despite this complexity of the issues, when I say we, I mainly mean our politicians and our governments, I think they're kind of living in a delusional kind of mindset where a singular magic solution is going to save. So you will see that the government is investing really sporadically in, say, solar projects here, EV projects there, and some mangrove restoration there, here and there, right? With the idea that all of these kind of sporadic, unrelated things are going to somehow reduce our overall climate risk. But I think as an urban planner, someone who studies cities and researches how they work and how they don't work, fundamentally for the climate challenge that we're facing, we really need to radically overhaul all the processes that really contribute to the building, designing, and managing of spaces and communities, right? And I think that's a very different approach than a sort of band-aid type solutions that address, singular pieces of a more complex system, right? So as an example, I think all of us across the Caribbean region, we're facing, pretty different levels of water insecurity, right? Because of reduced rainfall and of course, increased drought. And here, at least in Jamaica, the kind of general government approach has been public education, right? So commercials, flyers, jingles on the radio that tell people to change their behavior and tell them why and kind of how they should conserve more. But that alone can't be effective, right? what we need to be is kind of tackling these issues across multiple levels. So I'm an urban planner. So of course, one of those approaches is like thinking about building codes and approvals, right? I don't think any developer anywhere across the Caribbean should be allowed to sell a house that does not have a water storage tank or water efficient fixtures, because those things are no longer an amenity or a nice to have thing, right? They are necessities in this time that we're in. And in terms of policies, or water utility, at least here again in Jamaica, gets paid by people consuming water, right? So it's not really in their interest to encourage people to conserve more water in any, really substantial ways. So I think to your question, when we think about urban development in the era of climate breakdown, we really have to think about issues as systems that are really, really interlinked. They're not linear problems that can be solved with sort of singular solutions, right? So just as an example, tackling something as complex as water security in an urban environment requires not just design solutions or policy and regulation, but also public education and so much more, right? So I think my answer to that question is pretty complex, but I think we need to kind of embrace the complexity of these issues and understand that solutions are never going to be singular solutions. And what we really need is a whole kind of suite of fixes to tackle issues from multiple avenues, which means also kind of diversifying the people and the voices that are coming into the room as we're discussing urban issues and as we're discussing climate issues especially.
Wow, thank you for that, Dorraine. We're definitely in the era of climate breakdown, as you put it, and definitely there's need for, as you put it, a radical overhaul in the approach that we take to these challenges. I think in doing this work and in having these conversations, one thread that runs through it all is the way that all these issues are interconnected. We are doing ourselves a disservice when we take a siloed approach, and we definitely need to be more holistic when we look at the issues that are before us. As you pointed out, the issue of water insecurity, which is projected to worsen as we see these changing weather patterns and increased occurrences of drought. When we look at urban development and all these other issues, we see how complex it is and that it's a multidisciplinary challenge that requires a great deal of collaboration, between our government agencies or experts, architects, engineers, and the average citizen.
Totally. And I mean, I think a big part of it is that oftentimes, and especially for urban issues, it's very few people are in the room, right? Very few people are making these decisions. So you may have, 5 people, all with the engineering background, making critical decisions around how mobility works in a city, right? If they're all men, that definitely limits the kind of outcomes and how the kind of thoughtfulness and approaches for how spaces and way spaces work affect women or affect other voices that are not in the room, right? And I think that's kind of the kind of area that Island City Lab, or the idea of Island City Lab, was kind of born out of, right? Understanding that city planning needs to be a collaborative act, but it really isn't, So we started Island City Lab last year officially, so 2022. And the intention then was to kind of democratize, I guess, the processes that build, design, and govern our towns and cities across the Caribbean. And I think in my mind, what that means is getting regular people, so communities, residents, students, and concerned citizens, to have more of a say in the ways that cities are growing and developing. And as I said, like, the reality is things, very important decisions like where a road goes or how a park is designed or where public buses stop. It's made by a handful of people, but it impacts thousands, if not tens of thousands of people, right? So I think as a very small organization with our lofty goal, our aim really is to kind of expose these processes and the kind of inner workings and mechanics of how cities are built and invite more people to be a part of that process. Because I really think that getting more people, getting more voices and experiences in those spaces when those decisions are made creates for a more equitable society, a more equitable city and town, right?
Certainly, if we are able to have greater participation, widespread participation, then we would arrive at more effective solutions, when it comes to implementation, because we have the perspectives and the experiences and concerns of a wide cross-section of our society being considered, providing inputs, as opposed to just having a few persons making decisions. Urban planning is not just for the urban planner. It's for everyone who has to interact with the city and its infrastructure and all the other elements.
Totally. And I think, just as like a funny anecdote, when I went to planning school, when I went to get my master's in urban planning, one of the things they said is that people who are planners tend to be generalists, right? They're interested in lots of different things. And as a joke, what's that phrase? Jack of all trade, master of none. And I think it's true, right? That people who do planning work and people who are interested in planning work and are not like trained planners, you just have to be interested in things. And I think generally for those of us who live in cities or more urbanized areas across the Caribbean, you're interested in a bunch of different things, right? Because they affect your life all the time. There's a phrase that like, no one is a single issue person because we don't live single issue lives. So my interest in transportation is as high as my interest is in access to good quality food, right? Because all of these things impact my life. And I think you don't have to have a kind of background, a technical background in any of these things to have an interest and want to kind of express your opinion and your thoughts on how your spaces are kind of crafted and created around you.
That is so true. And I think that is also the beauty of the climate and sustainable development space. There's a point of entry for everyone. I've come into this space with an environmental background, but we also need our engineers. We also need our farmers. We need our creatives, so it's really for everyone to get involved because we are all impacted in some way and we also all have an impact.
Totally.
So, Dorraine, you shared a bit about what you set out to accomplish with Island City Lab. What has the journey been like so far?
That's an interesting question. I think it's been an exciting experience, right? I think anyone who kind of creates an organization, that the kind of original idea perhaps changes every couple of months, every couple of weeks, right? And I think because Island City Lab is kind of focused on research and like the creation of knowledge around urban issues across the Caribbean, what we're realizing as we started the organization is that the needs, especially here in Kingston and in Jamaica, are different than we expected, right? I think we thought we'd come back home and we'd do all of this research on transportation, on water, on, housing development and all of these things, and that would just kind of be it. I think we've realized that where we are is that our urban environments are created in intense silos. So a more important role for Island City Lab to serve is that of a convener. And what that means is really bringing people together. I feel like half of your time in the week is spent just talking to people, talking to engineers in, government roles, talking to community members who can never get a call with the engineers, talking with different people and different stakeholders who are all kind of collectively involved with building and designing space, but who don't talk to each other. And I think I've been told by a couple of folks that, that sounds nice, convening, that sounds nice, but that's not like the hard work. And I really disagree with that. I think in places like the Caribbean, where all of these decisions have really long-reaching impacts, and we don't talk to each other, we're really making terrible decisions that affect our urban environment that lasts for, decades and for generations. So I think a big part of our role right now, especially in the kind of beginning stage of Island City Lab, is really just talking to people, documenting. We have lots of interviews and kind of conversations with folks, and we share lots of that on our blog, right? So talking to one of the most interesting interviews we've had was with, he's a hydrogeologist from Jamaica. He worked at the Water Resource Authority from the 60s, right? So this is a man in his elder years. I think he's in his late 80s or so. And he talked about the creation of urban areas, right? He talked about the creation of Portmore, which is a kind of a satellite town to Kingston. And that was wild, right? Him talking about the decisions that were made way back in the 70s that could have radically transformed that entire urban area that has, thousands of people living there, right? So I think there is a certain level of excitement that I'm kind of in a role to be able to have these conversations and share this information. And also like not a burden, but a responsibility to disseminate this information, but also to kind of act upon it, which is a new kind of role Island City Lab has found itself in, right? We have this new line of work, which we're calling kind of like demonstration projects or initiatives. And the intention there is to take some of the things that we've been learning and actually put it into practice at a kind of a community scale. One of them is working with a urban kind of informal community called Cassava Peace to develop a solid waste management strategy, right? And the idea behind that, or the question behind that project, is like, how does an informal community solve their need for waste management? So that's actually garbage collection in lieu of that service being provided by the government, right? So we're talking about an urban community that the way that the community has been developed, the roads and the lanes are too narrow for a garbage truck to get into those communities. And because of that, they have no other sort of viable alternative than to throwing this waste in gullies, which I assume lots of Caribbean people know what a gully is, kind of a concrete kind of drainage channel that runs across the entire city. And I think with that project, the intention really is to work with community to kind of understand the physical issues that make that service difficult, and understand with them kind of the rationale behind the choices, whether you're burning your trash, whether you are taking your trash to somewhere else, whether you're throwing your trash in the gully. Understand why people do this, why it is that this is the only choices that they feel like they have, and then kind of working with them to co-create solutions that are better in terms of public health and in terms of environmental outcomes. So that's a project we're just starting now, and we're going to be continuing into next year. But I really am passionate about working at the scale of communities, because I think you're able to understand very specific problems, and then from then come up with solutions that could potentially be scaled to other communities that have similar issues.
Yes, this will definitely serve as blueprints that can work throughout the region. And I must thank you for taking on the role and serving as convener, because it's important to have these discussions. It's important to have these meeting points as we seek to somehow break these silos that seem to keep us bound in the region.
Yeah, and it's been exciting to do that.
Yeah, definitely the excitement keeps us going. And it's good to know that Island City Lab is a think tank, but it's not a talk shop. Sometimes we talk about the issues so much that we have limited action and implementation. So I'm very happy to hear about the demonstration projects being implemented.
Yeah, I think that was also an important part for us. Not kind of staying in a very academic space, right? Because I think a big part of that is like you can theorize on solutions that could potentially work, but how would you ever know if they actually do, right? And I think it's a scary process going into communities, whether you're from it or a neighbor to it, and saying, here are some ideas, or here's a process that you've probably not done before. Would you put your trust in us? Or like, how do we build trust with you for us to kind of go through this activity together? So it's definitely like a steep uphill curve in terms of learning for us, but I think it's a kind of essential part of what we want to be doing as an organization.
So in your experience and from your observations, can climate resilient urban planning also address social equity and inclusivity in the region?
Of course. Yes. I think when we think about urban systems not working or climate systems not working, the truth of the matter is oftentimes it's marginalized folks, people with the least amount of resources, that are on the kind of negative end of that, right? So here's an example. We've been having here in Kingston a series of massive road widenings, right? So the government is really building highways in the middle of people's communities. And that has resulted in an increase in, the number of kind of pedestrian fatalities. And who are pedestrians in, at least in a Jamaican context, folks who really have no other sort of transportation alternative, right? And similarly, when we think about climate systems not working, so when a hurricane comes and it's bigger or larger than than expected, the people who often bear the brunt of that are the folks who don't have the resources to, make their house withstand it. They don't have the resources to move out of the way, right? So I think if we think about climate resilient urban planning, you have to understand that the intention, especially if you're thinking about adapting communities to these new impacts, that it's definitely going to have a massive kind of social equity piece to it, right? And I'll give you another example. So in the projects that I mentioned, the kind of solid waste piece, in Cassava piece, that's the name of the community we're working in. People who live along gullies and there's a large amount of waste in these gullies, oftentimes those folks are also the most prone to getting mosquito-borne diseases. So we had an outbreak of dengue a couple of years ago, chickpea a couple of years ago. Now there's another upsurge of new strains of dengue. Communities that are living in these kind of conditions are the first set of communities to be impacted, right? Additionally, because you're living alongside a drainage canal, you're also much more likely to be impacted by flood risk, right? So as we're thinking about adaptation and thinking about the kind of relationships between flooding and solid waste management, there's like a kind of built-in equity sort of piece happening there. I don't want to take it for granted that there's lots of other kind of climate mitigation work that doesn't necessarily make those impacts, right? I think there are lots of projects that you've probably seen overseas, and potentially some in the Caribbean as well, where people are taking large swaths of either forested land or agricultural land to put these massive kind of solar fields. That is not innately a bad idea to have produced solar energy, but the kind of impacts and the kind of opportunities that you're wiping away to kind of do something like that, those are things that you really have to contemplate, you really have to consider. And I think, again, it kind of brings back the importance of focusing on like a small scale first and growing upwards to ensure that, they're not negative externalities, or that you are mediating for those negative externalities with whatever action you're doing.
That's an important consideration in terms of negative externalities. There are always trade-offs. Then there are aspects of our environment or even communities that are quote unquote sacrificed, and it's like, how are these decisions being made? How do we value human life? How do we value our environment, and how do these influence the way that we make policies, the decisions that we make about our development? So we see the issue of equity coming up a lot, the issue of justice. It seems like an elusive goal, but we definitely have to continue striving and pushing for it.
Mm-hmm. I agree.
I know you mentioned the solid waste project. I know that you have also been involved in nature-based solutions. Would you like to share a bit about that?
Yeah. Thanks for reminding me to speak about that. But one of the other projects we're working on is kind of like launching or kickstarting what we're calling a green collar workforce training program, right? And the question that kind of spurred us looking for funding and, winning a competition to get funding was like, how do we encourage the widespread take-up of nature-based solutions, right? Especially in urban areas. When the reality is that lots of people who are building homes or building buildings are not actually using the technical expertise of engineers or architects or any of those folks who may know how to do nature-based solutions, right? So we entered a competition with an engineering firm, really, and the kind of crux of it is that we're trying to build a vocational kind of curriculum around nature-based solutions for kind of small urban areas, right? So like if you have, say, a flooding issue in your front of your yard or the back of your yard or at a school, what are some non-hard engineering, but like actually efficient and effective nature-based solutions that can solve that flooding issue? And our idea is we're working with Heart Trust NTA, which is kind of like the body that controls vocational education here in Jamaica. And we're trying to work with them to kind of create a curriculum, right? So people who are already working at Heart are going to be ending up doing things like farming or landscaping or gardening or plumbing or construction, right? So these are folks that general Jamaican people who building their home, you're not going to call an architect, you're going to call a draftsman, or you're going to call someone who just does landscaping to come help you solve one of these issues. How do we then kind of disseminate this, I don't want to say quote unquote high tech, but this information that isn't kind of broadly known, how do we disseminate it within people that are doing the actual work, right? And again, that's a project that we are kind of just starting, but we're very excited about it, right? Because I think oftentimes lots of or kind of climate initiatives or climate solutions, they tend to be out of the reach of the vast majority of us living here, right? The average person cannot afford to put up a solar panel on their house. They can't, right? But what are kind of nature-based solutions that are achievable, that are kind of attainable, that potentially people can do themselves? These are things that can still help us adapt to the climate situation, but they're also affordable and they are relevant for a context. So that's something we need to be working on this year into next year.
I love that you all are taking the climate adaptation solutions to the people and making it practical and more attainable. Because, we can talk about it till like kingdom come, but we need implementation. We need people to integrate sustainability in various ways so that we can improve our resilience. So, Dorraine, what are some effective and relevant urban adaptation strategies that can be deployed at the community scale in the Caribbean?
I think that people, both in the climate space and outside of the climate space, often kind of confuse or conflate adaptation and mitigation, and they kind of think they're the same thing, but they really are not, right? So adaptation, I guess this is also my definition. Adaptation is really adjusting and changing the way we live to our expectations of like the new climate norms, right? And mitigation, on the other hand, is really avoiding or reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And to provide sort of context for the mitigation argument, like the Caribbean, and this, I don't think includes Guyana, but all of the islands in the Caribbean Sea contributes a total of 0.3% to global emissions, right? So that is a rounding error. It is so small, right? So I'm thinking that like a reduction of almost 0% is still 0%. And I think the point I'm making here is that I think within our context of very limited resources, very limited funding and investment, we really need to be putting all of our attention and all of our funding to adaptations, to really adapting our communities and our towns and our cities to making sure that they can withstand all the things that we have planned in our future, really, right? So as you had mentioned before, for the Caribbean, the IPCC is pretty clear about what we need to be expecting, right? Increased periods of drought, increased water insecurity, but also things like extreme heat temperatures, right? Which I think is something that we've been feeling a lot more this summer. And I think is probably the first time I've seen it in at least Jamaican news media so frequently. All throughout the summer, everyone was talking about heat and the impacts of heat on people's health, right? So to your question about urban adaptations that can be deployed, there are a lot of them. I'm just going to kind of walk through adaptations that I think address the issue of extreme heat, right? And when we talk about extreme heat, it means hotter than usual temperatures, right? So if the hottest average for where I live in Kingston is say 35 degrees, this summer is probably 36 or 37, which doesn't sound like a lot, but it is actually a very sort of insidious climate impact because we really underestimate how dangerous it is, right? Before moving back home to Jamaica, I was working in New York and worked on a project where we were studying kind of how extreme impact and extreme heat and kind of how it actually kills more people every year than every other natural disaster combined. And that's for New York City, right? And what public health officials and researchers found was that people who are living with non-communicable diseases. So that's something that we are very burned with here in the region, right? So diseases like diabetes and high blood pressure and heart and other respiratory diseases. When the temperature gets too hot, at a certain point, those folks can no longer thermoregulate, which means they can't really sweat anymore. And that kind of sends them into shock. So what the hospitals we're finding in New York, and I think our hospitals here in Jamaica and hopefully across the region are also realizing that on extremely hot days, more people are coming into the hospital with stroke and heart attacks and asthma attacks. And all of that is spurred on by this temperature increase, right? So that is the climate thing, right? So how do you adapt to something like that? The way that we build, and I'll talk specifically for Jamaica, is that like a well-built house in Jamaica is a concrete house. So concrete walls, concrete floor, and concrete roof. I think we'll also identify that that sort of building makes for a great oven. So our homes, while they, keep us safe from hurricanes and the roof won't blow off, they're also trap heat. Concrete buildings trap heat. So one of the adaptations that have existed, not just in New York, but it's really taking off across the world, also in tropical places, is the painting of your roof with something called a cool white paint. So it's not just like a regular paint that you paint your wall. It's a pretty thick, almost plastic type paint that you paint the surface of your roof, any type of roof, whether concrete or zinc or whatever else. And it is super reflective, super reflective. So it's a bright white. And the intention there, or the science behind it, is that super white paint reflects solar rays, and it can reflect up to 80% of the sun rays. So what that means is for you living in a concrete home, your house no longer holds and traps that heat, which makes it so much safer for someone living with one of these comorbidities, someone living with diabetes or asthma or any of these other issues, right? So thinking about something as simple as painting your roof white can really start to change the kind of experiences and the risk factors that people have. So that is at the scale of buildings, but you can think about what other sort of, community scale efforts can we do to reduce heat. And I'm sure half of the people that come on your show talk about planting trees, but they are legitimate, good technical investments in our climate future, right? So thinking at the community scale, what would it look like if we are going on a sort of a shade tree planting, mission to reduce heat gain in houses? So we're planting really tall, wide trees that can reduce and kind of shade out all of the sun that bakes our houses, and then therefore kind of reducing or exposure to these extremely dangerous temperatures. And I think that's kind of how we need to be thinking about adaptations, right? Looking at what the technical or the environmental risk is, and not just focusing on just one solution, but a suite of solutions that are at different price points, that are at different sort of expertise points. And that's how we need to be thinking about these things, right? Because a white roof may not work for everybody, but maybe trees can work for other communities, right? So I really think approaching and kind of tackling these things at a systems level is really important if the intention is to really adapt and to make our community safer.
Yeah. Thanks for pointing out that link between extreme heat and non-communicable diseases, which is already a burden on our healthcare system and the quality of life of our populations, and for sharing those practical solutions for climate adaptations. It doesn't always have to be complicated or super technical or with exorbitant costs. There are simple solutions. As you said, we need to put forward the options that are available and help persons to make informed choices.
And that's also the most important part, right? Because if every solution is a super high-tech solution, the uptake is going to be zero. It's going to be a handful of people.
Exactly.
So I think providing as many solutions at different price points it's very important if this is the end goal, making stronger, safer communities.
And again, that's where awareness comes in, because if people don't know what their options are, then they just revert to, or they resort to what they know, what's the norm.
Yeah. And to that point, sorry to interrupt you, but because of all of the heat-related kind of scares and issues we've been facing in Jamaica over the past summer, there have been lots of kind of public schools. So this is high schools and primary schools saying these concrete buildings are baking us. Our students can't learn, teachers can't teach, teachers are fainting on campus. And unfortunately, instead of thinking about these, long-term solutions like painting the roofs white, insulation, shade trees, the government is now planning to air condition lots of these schools. Air condition is not the solution that makes sense for our context, not just in Jamaica, but anywhere in the Caribbean that has extremely high electricity costs, right? All of us have some of the highest costs of electricity. So we understand innately that air condition is like not the logical solution, nor is it, a long-term sustainable solution. So to your point, yes, letting people know that there's a bevy of solutions that have trade-offs is kind of really important.
So if it were up to you, Dorraine, what strategies would you prioritize for fostering climate resilient urban development in the Caribbean?
That's another hard and exciting question to answer, right? And I'm kind of probably going to sound like a broken record and say the same thing. I really think giving local communities more tools and more autonomy to solve their specific climate and sort of spatial problems is definitely going to foster more climate resiliency, right? I think as a planner, I think I also, and I'm kind of like a very idealistic person, I'll be honest. I think I do struggle with that. And this idea that like, if the vision or the ideas that I have don't have value across the entire country, that it's not worth doing. And I think that is wrong. I think it's flawed. And I'm constantly trying to unlearn that, right? Because I think the local scale is where we live our lives, right? It's where you spend most of your time. It's also where most of your, deep relationships are. So when a disaster hits, the neighbors around you, the people around you, the local community is most, I guess, intimately aware of that experience because it's shared, right? And I think because of that shared knowledge, because of there's a shared understanding and potential levels of trust within your community, it's also the scale that we really need to be thinking about investing in when we talk about climate resiliency, right? So what does it look like for, I don't know, maybe a community level emergency management course or program to be happening, right? What would it look like if we are teaching folks who run churches, who run basic schools or daycares in communities? What would it look like if we're teaching them, this is what you need to do right after a hurricane? This is what you need to do right after an earthquake, right? How do communities, go from those ideas of like being able to identify key issues, key problems that they're facing? So how do they start to kind of pool resources and invest in something like a water catchment as a backup supply? How do you do that? How do communities bring in the resources, the expertise that they may have within that community to do something like that? And I think one of the kind of inspiring examples of that is what happened in Puerto Rico after Hurricane Maria. Lots of communities, because they're so negatively impacted and, sort of continuously impacted by electric utility that's not providing their needs, several communities pooled resources and did kind of fundraising together to get solar powered microgrids within small couple block size communities, right? And I think that's kind of where we need to be thinking. The scale of planning and innovation that I think me and Island City Lab are most interested and most passionate about is really at that local scale, because that's where you are best equipped to identify what the real problems are, what the real issues are, and then ideate and innovate around, what solutions the community can own and manage together.
In the last episode, I spoke to Marian Osieo, and we spoke about how we can empower marginalized communities to become more involved in the decisions pertaining to sustainable development that affect them and, equip them to produce their own solutions. And part of this is rebuilding that social fabric, amplifying the contributions of persons from marginalized groups, and celebrating their contributions as well. And also critical to this is, as you mentioned earlier, knowledge sharing, educating persons, creating awareness, and providing resources for communities for them and by them. So I think there are many ways to tackle the challenge of climate resilience and urban development, but definitely community engagement is very critical.
It is. And unfortunately, I feel like because the climate space is so kind of I don't say filled, but like it's really crowded by people who are technologists, right? So people who are like this high tech, I don't know, electric vehicle or solar panel or renewable energy thing is going to save us, right? I feel like it definitely pushes the folks who are like, oh, community action is really important. It kind of pushes those people to the side. And I mean, time and time again, I think there's so many stories and evidence of after a disaster, you are relying on people. You know what I mean? So yeah, I guess that's just my pitch to tell people like this is really important as well.
Yeah, for sure. So Doreen, for all listeners who are passionate about climate resilience, what actions can they take to support urban development efforts in the Caribbean?
I'll say it again, don't be fooled by scale and the idea that if your ideas or things you're passionate about working are not happening at the national scale, that they're not important. That's not true, right? So I would say for anyone who like is passionate about any element of like climate adaptation or resilience, get involved with local community groups, community organizations, right? So whether it's your church, your school, parent, teacher association, those kind of getting involved with institutions within communities is really important. Another institution I'd really recommend that I feel like often people ignore are resident associations. And I'm sure they probably have different names in different islands, but here in Jamaica, we call them resident associations. I think what you'll immediately realize, and I'm speaking from experience, recently got involved with the resident association where I lived over the past 2 years or so. One, you'll realize that it's mainly older folks. So I'm literally the youngest person at each of these meetings, right? And I'm in my 30s, right? So getting involved, bringing youth sort of involvement and bringing your sort of awareness of climate impacts is really important to those conversations. When we sit down as a community in these associations, we're talking about different issues. Of course, the elderly folks are talking about issues which are important, right? They're talking about sort of crime or safety, stuff like that, and kind of the cleanliness of the community. It's not for, climate change not impacting them, but they don't necessarily have the language or the sort of connection that extreme heat is something we are all struggling with because all our houses are built the same exact way, right? So kind of trying to come and work in community and just being like, all right, guys, here's another issue. We may not identify as a problem at the community scale, but extreme heat is a problem that we're all facing and that we could potentially work on solutions together. Those ideas that I kind of popped off my head about like tree planting initiatives I've been trying to kind of get started in the community. And I won't lie and say it's easy and it's fun all the time because it's not. Anyone who works in community or works with community knows that it's a very difficult process. You're dealing with lots of different personalities and it's hard, right? It's hard to build consensus across, couple scores of people. But at the end of the day, that is really the work, right? How do you build consensus? How do you build passion and kind of investment in ideas? Because at the end of the day, that's kind of what the nation is doing at a larger scale, right? So I think being able to get these experiences within your community scale, master it, figure out how do you do advocacy? How do you do support? How do you do, education, public education in these spaces is really important work. And any sort of technical knowledge or understanding of climate issues, that's where you bring it in. That's where you invest it, right? So in the midst of me, working with the community to do a community barbecue and setting up tables, I'm like, are you guys experiencing heat? Is it really hot today? What about these tree planting stuff? So kind of dropping it in and out as you're doing community work, as you're building relationships with people, is I think really important. And I think it's often kind of overlooked as an essential part of climate adaptation.
Absolutely. So, Dorraine, I really want to thank you for sharing your insights on the intersection of climate resilience and urban development, as well as for providing us with practical solutions for climate adaptation, and also for the work that you're doing with Island City Labs, serving as a convener, but not just stopping there, but also implementing at the community level. But as we wrap up today's episode, I would love to hear from you. What would make the world a better place?
I think you know my answer. I'm going to say it again and again, right? I think more citizen action is where it's at, right? I would love a world where people in community can come up with their own plans, their own master plans for how their community is going to look in the next 5 years, in the next 10 years, and setting these visions, and then everyone kind of falling into that vision, right? So right now, the model that exists in Jamaica and across the Caribbean is that, some person in the government comes up with the idea about how cities and how communities should look without any sort of involvement with community, right? And that's how our spaces grow in a very uninformed way. And I think what would make the world and would make the Caribbean a much better place if community members had more autonomy to make those decisions, to kind of host and design those visions in a structured way, and allow their communities to kind of match up with that vision that they're designing themselves. That's my hope for the future, and that's kind of the goal that Island City Lab is striving for autonomous communities that are informed enough to understand the systems, to understand climate change, to understand urban planning, to understand urban economics, and with that information, being able to design and facilitate, the shared visions of their own communities.
Yes, citizen action from informed and autonomous communities. I love that.
Yeah.
So how can listeners connect with you?
Yeah. So we are currently building our website. So I'm super excited. Hopefully by the end of the year, we'll have our website launched. But until then, you can follow us at Island City Lab on all the social medias. So Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn. We release all of our information about our events on all the social media, our blogs as well. And yeah, if you're interested in kind of writing stories about spaces, so your communities, urban communities, anywhere across the Caribbean, Island City Lab blog is welcoming pitches, right? So if you have any sort of ideas around your communities, how to make them better, particularly urban communities, feel free to reach out to Island City Lab on any of our socials and pitch an idea. And we're super interested in collaborating and working with people to add graphics to stories that they're telling of their urban spaces. I think we learn a lot that way. And excited to kind of co-build and to develop knowledge together.
Great. So guys, get involved. Follow Island City Lab, no S, on their socials. Yeah. And again, thank you so much for the work that you do, and your advocacy and your contribution to knowledge creation and sharing in Jamaica and the wider Caribbean.
Thank you for having me, Derval.
My pleasure. Thank you for joining us for another episode of the Climate Conscious Podcast. We'd love to hear from you. Let us know your thoughts on the show, or if there's any topic you'd like us to cover. Write to us at theclimateconscious@gmail.com, or simply leave a review on your favorite app. Remember to follow The Climate Conscious on all social media platforms. See you next week.